Hi all. An interesting game today, especially from a psychological perspective. Vishwanathan Anand having 2 losses in a row. Did he want to try and win at all costs today to try and make sure that in the remaining games he can catch up? Or would he just want to stop the flow of losses and maybe try and just secure a draw? But he was playing with the white pieces today. Let's see what happened. He kicked off with e4 and Magnus played e5. Classical response. Knight f3, knight c6, the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game as it's referred to. Bishop b5. Well, actually it's bishop b5 that signifies the Ruy Lopez, named after a Spanish priest actually, Ruy Lopez, one of the oldest analysed openings in chess history. We see now knight f6. So this is the Berlin Wall system, start of the Berlin defence or Berlin Wall. And here we see a slight variance from the most mainline move, which is just a castle, which often involves the queens coming off later, black having the 2 bishops. And black's doing usually very well in this line. Vishy decided here to actually play d3, so reinforcing that e4 pawn. The most common variation, as we're used to seeing, is just castling. Knight takes e4, and after d4, knight d6. This is a very, very common variation, which we've seen in many, many games, and in an earlier game in this World Championship. So it's all avoided because of this d3 move, reinforcing the e4 pawn. We see bishop c5 now, which is a very active move, preferred to d6, closing in the bishop. Magnus Carlsen develops the bishop to c5. And here usually c3 or castling are the most common moves, but we see bishop takes c6, so doubling black's pawns. The usual way of recapturing here, it looks as though there's 2 viable options, but actually there's non-existent games for b takes c6. And let's have a quick check on that, just from a theoretical point of view. I think here, just knight takes e5 is actually just nabbing that pawn without any punishment here. It's essential to be able to take with the d pawn here for knight takes e5 to be unplayable, because then we have queen d4, so double attacking here the knight and f2, and black's winning there. So let's see, after d takes c6, knight bd2 is played, and Vishy indicated in the press conference that both players have played this move in the past. This knight maneuver looks like to be a very familiar knight maneuver, usually in the Ruy Lopez, say to g3, then knight f5, sometimes to e3. So let's see, bishop g4 pinning now the f3 knight. This is kicked or asked to capture on f3. And actually the most common response, was only a very small game sample, is to immediately capture on f3. But Magnus actually plays bishop h5. And it gives the possibility to white of actually playing g4 here, but I don't think this is a big deal for black. Bishop g6, we've just created some weaknesses here, and black should be fine. For example, this position, black can still play queen e7 and maybe castle queenside, so this isn't going to be attacking the black king or anything. It's just potential targets of attack though. In the long run, these could be weak, these pawns. So we see actually after h3, bishop h5, that g4, the temptation to play g4 is resisted. We instead see knight f1, so without castling, not a routine move, but it looks as though the knight can comfortably come to g3, saving time if that maneuver is of interest. Because if white castled, it will be yet another move to move the rook and then do this maneuver. So doing it straight away makes sense if the knight's coming to g3 here to attack that bishop without creating structural weaknesses, which g4 does. So we see now actually a very interesting move from Magnus as well. Knight d7, it's almost as if there's a parallel maneuver potentially in mind like this to reinforce control of d4, maybe even if4. So a parallel maneuver potentially. black doesn't have to castle kingside. He can actually prepare also to castle queenside. With king going to c8. We see now knight g3, and here Magnus Carlsen, maybe to some surprise of some people, he just gave up voluntarily his light square bishop. So you might ask, well, what if bishop g6? Is it that bad? From a scientific engine perspective, engines are keen actually, it seems, on either bishop g5 here or just simply castling. It looks as though there's a small advantage potentially for white. I guess this structure is like granite to that bishop. That bishop really hasn't got scope. I mean, if ever f6 and bishop f7, then that a knight coming to f5 might be attractive. So Magnus perhaps reasons it's no point having that bishop in against this particular structure. He just takes on f3 immediately here, and we see queen takes f3. We don't want double pawns in this scenario, so unnecessarily queen takes f3. And now knight f5 is actually a significant threat. If, for example, queen e7, knight f5 would be a nuisance move. And if, for example, queen f6, h4 might actually threaten now bishop g5. So this is getting to be a nuisance. And you might think, well, h6, it's unnecessary to allow this knight to f5. Magnus actually plays preventative move g6, even though it does weaken some dark squares, but the black king doesn't have to castle on the king side. And we see now after bishop e3 that the move queen e7 has dual purpose. It not only protects the c5 bishop, black's preparing now to castle queenside, which in its own right will put a rook on d8, staring down the d file and helping control that very important d4 square here. And in fact, Vichy decides to castle queenside here. You might ask, could he castle kingside? I think it is a reasonably good move as well, at least from an engine point of view. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with this. Black hasn't got a major attack in mind here. There's various moves that black could try. Even castling queenside doesn't seem out of the question. Opposite side castling. If ever something like this, the knight could just drop back. It's not a big deal. Black would have to open up lines. But actually Vichy decided to castle queenside here. There's also no problem with that. The beauty of casting queenside is that sometimes d4 can be facilitated with that rook automatically on d1 here. And now black castles queenside. Knight e2 now, as though there's an interest in playing for d4. Let's just examine this position though. Possibly, if white wants to change the pawn structure here and play d4 with the idea that these four pawns would essentially be against three pawns. If you look at the board from this point on, we would have a pawn majority here, whilst on the queen side these double pawns, it's like they're just one pawn. So playing for d4, knocking out e5 is strategically interesting. And in the live commentary today with my friends, we had a look at d4 after the game. Let's have a quick look here. It just seems that black might have sufficient piece activity and may even be worse if white's not careful. So bishop takes d4. Let's have a look from an engine point of view at this position, because it looks as though structurally there's something to be gained from this majority of pawns. It's a classic plan, but in practice e4 is vulnerable, so either knight c5 or rook e8 targets e4, and also now the rook has to move or be protected. If the rook's protected, for example, rook takes, and now rook e8, and there's significant pressure on e4 here. Say queen a3, check. There just seems to be sufficient play for black in this position. a6 just protecting that pawn. The pawn, exploiting this kind of theoretical pawn majority is easier said than done with all these pieces on the board. It's an interesting idea structurally to play d4, but black's piece activity seems ample and sufficient for a long time to come here. So d4 perhaps isn't all that to be able to play d4 in this position, but it's definitely worth some investigation here. Another possibility, which we were looking at instead of knight c5, is knight e5. This might be less accurate than knight c5. Let's see, queen e3, rook takes, queen takes. Now a7 is under fire, so let's protect that. Say c5, queen e3. And we were looking at possibilities actually of knight c4. An active knight here could be a nuisance combined with pressure on the e-pawn. So again, it's easy to say the structure is a pawn majority, but how to actually exploit this in practice, it's going to be quite tricky indeed. Engines actually believe at quite a large depth that black is actually a tiny bit better here. So it seems this seemingly thematic structural move, the opportunity here to play d4, doesn't seem to provide anything concrete. So instead Vichy plays knight e2 as though d4 might be prepared in the future, but it allows a prophylaxis move, rook e8 against d4, because it really automatically exposes e4. If d4 is played here, it's exposing that e4 pawn, which can actually just simply be taken here, snapped up with queen takes e4. So it's completely discouraged actually d4, which is the main thematic break here in this position. We see now king b1. It looks a bit of a waiting move. Okay, it's against any potential threat on a2, you can argue, like queen e6, which we've seen in an earlier game. b6, which means the knight might be free to move and the king can move here as well. h4. As though there's an interest in h5 and a little bit of a surprise. You might think if this is useful to play h5 and activate this rook, that black might be interested in playing h5. Engines suggest this is a reasonable move. There's no big deal about this move. If bishop g5 trying to skewer, we just answer with f6. It's no big deal at all, this position. Really, this is quite okay. So let's see, h4 is actually interesting that Magnus just completely ignores this h4 and just plays king b7. He doesn't really mind h5 at all. And h5 is played. And now Magnus takes on e3. So here we're at a juncture. Does white want the double pawns? Well, if f takes e3, well, the upside is we get that dynamic f file. The downside, structural issues like this could be a problem, especially like later in the game sometimes. So let's say rook f8, g4, knight c5. At least the double pawn here, this one in particular, means that this maneuver is covered. d4 and f4 are covered here. But even so, the knight could still come to e6. And what is white's actual exploitable targets in this position with this f file? It just seems solid enough, especially if you consider a move like knight g5 here, technically is a very, very comfortable knight on a dark square, which is difficult to get rid of. There's no f pawn to use, there's no h pawn, so this position looks as though it's very, very solid, fortress-like position as a consequence of the double pawns. So it seems that f file dynamism, if it doesn't mean anything, it can lead to a horrible knight on g5, as this engine variation suggests. But let's have a look. So in the game, actually, Vichy actually took with queen takes e3, and now knight c5, and without anything covering d4 and f4, it seems a very logical maneuver to do this. H takes g, and now g3. So trying for this pawn majority, if that pawn is knocked out or it takes, we end up still with a potentially good pawn majority in the centre. These rolling pawns, central pawn mobility will be in white's favour slightly. Magnus now plays an interesting move. Doesn't seem bothered at all by f4. He just plays a5. And in fact, f4 is not played here. Again, another tempting move, but let's have a look concretely at f4. I think Magnus had indicated he could just play f5, and the engine is suggesting f5 is a good move here. So say e takes, g takes. Is it a big deal, this position? It looks as though black has not got that much of an issue here in this kind of position. The only, you might think, well, f5 might be vulnerable. If we try to attack f5 like this, we can end up in tactical trouble. Maybe queen f7, asking the rook to go away, and it's no big deal really. So, okay, this f4, another seemingly thematic idea after a5 is not used, just rook h7, and this allows now a trade of rooks, rook h8, rook d h1. It doesn't make sense to give black the h file, so following up, just keeping possession of the h file, rook takes, but now a simple move which can challenge the h file again is played, which is queen f6. Also keeps an eye on this strong point and the d4 square like this, and facilitates rook h8 to challenge the rook on the h file. Here, in fact, it is ventured to play f4, finally a strategic pawn move which looks in theory quite favourable, but in practice, how favourable is this? We see rook h8, and now another exchange of rooks, and the problem here tactically, f takes e5 looks quite interesting to be able to play d4, but it doesn't quite work, at least to win a piece or anything. F takes e is played. If it's not, then maybe black could even consider taking to extend the scope of the queen on this diagonal and playing knight e6 to reinforce d4 control, but it is taken. Queen takes e5, and d4 is just not playable here because the queen is loose on e3, so we'd have queen takes e4. That's just getting a pawn. So given d4's not playable, black has got this dark square blockade on that very important d4 square. In this position, you might think, well, hold on, can we play for d4? Can we play c3 here in this exact position? It is possible, but the queen being loose means actually maybe there's a possibility of f5 to exploit that loose queen here. And this might actually be quite favourable for black. Say queen h8 now. We've got active possibilities and play and pressure on e4. Alternatively, well, maybe here, if king c2, we've got some active possibilities. So it's not so clear cut to play c3 immediately here to aim for d4. Instead, Vishy played actually queen f3. So it looks as though it's trying to discourage f5 because we've also got this diagonal potentially opening up. But f5 can be played there, and it is actually played there to put more pressure on e4. This is taken. I'm not sure what else. Again, d4 we just take on e4. So it's taken. And now g takes f5. So both sides have an isolated pawn on this king side, which kind of balance each other out. Now c3 is played. So with the threat of not just d4, which doesn't do much actually because it's check there, so it's not winning a piece again, but it supports knight d4, which could help target c6 here. So there's a bit of coordination going on, but this is parried now in advance with knight e6. And now we see king c2. What is the idea of king c2? The king maybe is a little bit safer on c2 in this position than on b1, but white is not going for d4 here, I believe. It gets close to the centre just in case there's an endgame. If we had played d4, let's play d4 instead of king c2, then in fact queen b5 might be quite interesting. A bit of pressure on here. And maybe knight g5 to e4 more significantly, and then there might be actually a concrete threat in the future. So the king, okay, the king goes to c2 now. And from an engine point of view, this is a dead level position at move 29. I mean 0-0-0, dead level. Knight g5, hitting the queen. The queen must keep protection of the knight. I don't think it's a big deal, in fact, if the queen goes to g2 or f2. Engines suggest it doesn't really matter at all here. If knight d4 is the actual perceived threat in the position, knight e6 now squashes that threat, and it's equal again. But actually, Vishy plays queen f2, and it invites a threefold repetition. Knight e6, queen f3, knight g5, queen f2, knight e6, and draw by threefold repetition. It's too simplified, it seems, for white to do anything concretely. Both sides have equal number of weaknesses here, these isolated pawns. There's nothing much, it seems, to play for here. d4 would just be compromising white's position, in fact, because of queen e4. Checking actually black would be slightly better now. Following up maybe c5 dissolving his double pawns. So there's no point playing that. So there's no real strategic breaks, nothing much going on. And we have a draw by threefold repetition today, which is a shame because I had my good friends Paul Georgiou and Alex Eflontis. Now maybe one or two of them will be back tomorrow, so I hope you follow my live commentary tomorrow on this channel. I hope you enjoyed this a little bit, this summary of this game. It wasn't that exciting today, but it means that Vishy Anand has at least broken the string of the two strings of the two losses in a row, which must be hard to bear. So maybe tomorrow we're going to see him fighting with the black pieces. He has had good positions with black in this match, so I don't think it's a major disadvantage to try for a win with black. Sometimes, if you're in the right psychological frame of mind or better opening preparation, you can end up better with the black pieces. So the fight's not over. But I guess today's result does suit Magnus Carlsen a bit. He's getting a little bit closer to winning the match. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.